Okay, so as I said, many thanks, Dylan, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with all of you and to support your Student Society Rise and Recover on behalf of the Department of Classical and Archaeological Studies. It is amazing what you're doing to fight eating disorder. And this week is a special week called Eating Disorder Week. So this event has the aim to raise funds for BEAT, the UK's leading charity helping people with eating disorders. And the Rise and Recovery Society has set up a link, which I copied in the chat. And you know, even a tiny donation of £1 could make the difference. It's not compulsory, but we put it there. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a topic that is related to my research and to the topic of eating disorder as well. The topic is the perception and the representation, especially of the body, and especially the female body. Over the years, I have studied women, their social status, and the social perception of their bodies in Dynastic and Greco-Roman Egypt. My interest for this topic comes from a wonderful experience in Egypt as an MA student, in fact, back in 2007 at the University of Bologna. So in 2007, I started collaborating with the university to excavate in the Greco-Roman village of Bachias, where we found houses, temples, and even the Roman bath. But inside both the houses and the temples in this village, there were high quantities of amulets and terracottas, which I noticed were connected with personal protection, but also female fertility. And in particular, the most frequent amulets that we found were amulets of Bes and the Tauret. But also we found terracottas, and these represented, for example, Isis. So for my PhD, I have decided to expand on the topic of women's everyday life, and I wrote an extensive research on the social perception of women's bodies during their life cycle. So I investigated the most important phases in women's life, coming of age, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. I left out death, which is the topic of my third book. In fact, I'm going to talk about their social representation of, this time, not women in general, but unmarried women, maidens. This is a bit of an old-fashioned term, but it really sums up their status. The social representation of maidens in their funerary commemoration. So I will study the funerary sets, the funerary monuments, but also their bodies, how they were buried. So this time I will not just focus on Greco-Roman Egypt, but on the evidence for burials and funerary monument of married women in various sites of Italy, Greece, and Egypt between the 5th century BC and the 4th century AD. So my study of female bodies in ancient Egypt, and more recently in the Greco-Roman world, has touched on many topics. The common theme in this study was how society perceived female bodies, and how this perception shaped the religious ideas, legal texts, medical care, and the artistic representations of these bodies. So just to give you an example of the religious ideas, I looked at the ideas around pollution and sacred law. So for example, are women's bodies considered polluted or polluting? If this is the case, in which phases of their lives? I examined, for example, ideas around pollution from menstruation and the childbirth in Dynastic and Greco-Roman Egypt, with a comparison with the Near East and Greece. So such ideas affected, as you can imagine, the way women used the domestic space, and also how they had access to public sacred spaces, such as temples. But for example, also to give you an idea about legal texts, so I looked at how, what are women allowed to do with their bodies? So for example, can they decide to have an abortion? Or can they decide whether they can recognize their child or not? Can they be their mothers, or, you know, is the husband that decides for them? I also looked at medical care. So, for example, ideas about the development of gynecology, for example. But it's something that I didn't look as much at, and I regret that, because I could have given a very specific talk on that today. Is diet. Perhaps because there isn't that much in this sense, and I'm going to talk about that again in a moment. And finally, which is this is what I'm going to talk about today mainly, is the artistic representation of females' bodies. So figurines, for example, which are very understudied still. And these representations can connect to the religious sphere, but also to funerary contexts and big question marks, dolls, toys. This is the big problem. And I'm looking at this right now. But before we move on to talk about the figurines, I'd like to mention a blog article by a professor of Hellenic Studies, Hélène Morales, who from the University of California, which seems to be very relevant for today's general aim, really general topic. This article, which is called Fat Classics, Dieting, Health and Hijacking of Hippocrates, raises the issue of eating disorder as a hidden problem in academia. And this affects students as well as staff. And unfortunately, such problem is sometimes aggravated by the stigma imposed by certain people, such as this associate professor at the University of New Mexico, who a few years ago tweeted, "Dear obese PhD applicants, if you didn't have the willpower to stop eating carbs, you won't have the willpower to do a dissertation." Truth. So well done to this person. But the other problem, broader, which goes farther than academia, is the issue with lots of reckless people. Sorry for the strong words, but I don't have any other word, who are trying to sell ancient diets, or paleo diets, as the Morales calls them, based on wrong or simplistic interpretations of ancient medical texts. So this is one of the aphorisms that are taken out of context. For example, people who are naturally very fat are apt to die earlier than those who are thin. This is from aphorism 244. So Morales says this is taken out of context, first of all, because Hippocrates speaks against the gluttony, but does not connect to being fleshy with gluttony. Indeed, there is a category of being naturally fleshy. And then second, Morales said this aphorism simply means that when it is the time to die naturally, people who are naturally fleshy take less time to die. So this is seen as a positive by the Hippocratic writer. So my talk today, as I said, will focus on the artistic representation of the female body in funerary and religious contexts, from the Dynastic to the Greco-Roman period. But I will also mention how the figurines produced in Egypt and especially in late Dynastic Egypt had a more or less direct impact on the iconography of women's bodies in archaic and classical Greece. Of course, this is a popular talk, is not an academic talk, so the nuances will be left out for today. I hope you will excuse me for that. But this study on the dynastic figurines is mainly based on my second book. So let's have a look at these figurines. Most of the votive images of women in the dynastic period are small statues. We can't call statuettes, I don't know, made of faience, raw or baked clay, ivory, wood or limestone, and they measure roughly between 3 and 30 centimeters, so they vary quite a lot in size. They were produced from the Middle Kingdom until the New Kingdom, so with some types that were produced still in the late dynastic periods and other even towards the Roman period, so very long-lasting ones. And there are thousands of them, thousands of known figurines. You can find them almost in every Egyptian museum in the world, but only about, I would say, 700 examples of Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom figurines have a known archaeological context, and this is a big problem. They were found in tombs, in urban spaces and temples, Some figurines were found in rubbish deposits, and they were broken in antiquity. This was especially noticed by Elizabeth Varaska in the precinct of Mut in Karnak. And therefore, it may be that they were charged with a magical power during a ritual, and so on. They were used only temporarily, and once they were used for such ritual, they were discarded. So what did they represent? You can also make your own ideas about it and say, okay, I think this could represent this. They don't have a particular attributes. So this is quite controversial. We don't know what they represent. We cannot connect them with a particular Egyptian goddess, for example. And Varaska again, she argued that if they had represented a goddess too specifically, that goddess might have got hurt during a ritual. So the Egyptians didn't want to create voodoo dolls to hurt their favorite goddesses. And I quite like this theory, to be honest. So if they didn't represent a deity in particular, who did they represent? Arguably, I would say a generic ideal woman. And what were the characteristics then of an ideal woman in ancient Egypt? Nothing related to body weight, shape, or proportion. More something related to their age, for example. In the Papyrus Westcar, we have 20th century, we can see that younger women are defined as never opened by childbirth. Other elements that made women beautiful could be simply purchased. Wigs, for example, were items that made women beautiful. Perfumed fat combs, which you can see represented in that fresco, but they were recently archaeologically discovered in Amarna, and they were actually less squidgy and softer than what everyone imagined them to be. They were quite solid. Tattoos, bodily tattoos, jewels such as girdles and amulets. And you can see some of these elements on this faience figure in the blue one, who has tattoos on her legs, and she's completely naked. So she's exposed, and her pubic triangle is well marked. And also you can see, perhaps not in this photo, but her belly button is also marked. So according to Pinch, this tattooed and truncated Middle Kingdom female figure was mainly found near royal mortuary temples in sites such as Azazif, Lisht, and Laun. So there is probably a connection. As I said, they do not represent any woman in particular, nor any goddess, but some of these types could be connected with one goddess in particular, or at least the cult of this goddess, who is Hathor, the goddess of love and fertility, and in particular with the priestesses of Hathor, who were often members of the elite, and they were buried sometimes not far from the royal mortuary temples. And indeed, the cowrie girdles, so girdles with cowrie shells, or golden reproduction of cowrie shells, represented on these figurines, are also worn by several princesses and girls from different Middle Kingdom burials, for example, in Lisht, the complex of Senusret I, in Dashur, the complex of the pyramid of Senusret III. I'm just giving you some examples. So you might also have noticed that these figurines don't have any legs or feet. This is still quite a mystery. We are always discussing, what is this? I don't know. The original theory is that they were concubines of the dead. And it's quite funny to say that now. But because they were found in tombs of men, the theory was that they were made to revive the men sexually. And the legs in this context were omitted so that they could not leave the tomb. They were stuck with these men for eternity. However, while the omission of the leg cannot be excluded, because we have seen that for other figurines, the legs were omitted to not let them escape. This concubine theory has been discarded because the figurines were also found in tombs of women and the children. So my theory for the lack of the legs is that the feet were not needed. What was represented there what was necessary for the rituals that needed to be performed. And the important parts were the ones connected with the sexuality and fertility. But the power that these figurines had went well beyond ensuring fertility. Various sets of spells and rituals show that these figurines were charged with magical power in order to heal various patients or make specific requests to the dead, such as, can I conceive a child? After the magical ritual was fulfilled, as I said, some of these figurines were broken and discarded, but not all of them. Another group of figurines, certainly related to the cult of Arthur, and produced between the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Period, are the so-called paddle dolls. Their name derives from the paddle-shaped body, and some recalls the menet counterpoise, which is a musical instrument, basically, used during the rituals for Arthur. You can see it on the left. These figurines had a menet-shaped body, which was made of wood, and the head, when it is preserved, not in this case, for example, is either made of wood as well, or it is roughly modeled using unbaked clay. The eyes were made of beads pressed into the clay, when the head is preserved. And as you can see, these paddle dolls have a wig with unbaked mud beads. So I've said that the wig is quite important to represent women. I put the term doll there, but it's between quotation marks because I completely disagree, like now most of us, with calling them dolls. They were not toys. They were also found in tombs of adults and among objects with a ritual meaning, such as the tomb set of the Ramesseum. So they also have a very explicit pubic triangle, which, to be honest, doesn't look very toy-like to me. But this could be just, an interpretation of biased by our time. So, like the limbless figures, the paddle dolls, as we have seen, had very pronounced genitals, and a special characteristic in addition to that. You could turn the figurine to either reveal or hide the pubic triangle. And this gesture was not just something, like a nice trick to do, but it was connected with a religious story. According to, this is a theory brought out by Ellen Morris, a story called The Contendings of Horus and Seth, where Hathor, the goddess Hathor, decided to reveal her genitals, her pubic triangle, to her father Ra in order to revive him and to give him energy. So perhaps according to this theory, the paddle dolls were, they were representations of Arthur revealing herself, but also perhaps represented the real people, the priestesses, dancers of Arthur, who were also revealing themselves. We don't know that for sure, but it's an exciting theory. And one of the proofs to say that perhaps these paddle dolls were real people is that we don't have just adult dolls, but we also have girl dolls or, child dolls. So dolls of different size. And so why should we have a child doll if it was just a musical instrument without an identity? Anyway, so I wanted to show you a few more dynastic dolls from, I would say, from the Second Intermediate Period all the way to the New Kingdom, which also show that there are some Near Eastern influences coming into Egypt, which could influence the way these figurines were represented. So, for example, the first one is, I call it the big-nosed face. Because it reminds us of Assyrian figurines that were produced in Carchemish during the late Bronze Age, in the late 3rd millennium BC. It's different from the faience one also because it was handmade rather than made in a mold which I forgot to say about the other one. So it's different technique, and probably there's a Near Eastern influence. The many figurines of this kind, hand-modeled ones, were also found in Gebelzeit, which is a mountain area by the Red Sea. And between the Second Intermediate Period and the beginning of the New Kingdom, I'll also give you calendar dates here, so 1800 to 1500 BC, Gebelzeit had important mines of galena, which was used for the production of the eye cosmetic kohl, so another very important item for women, but not just women. And the patron goddess of these mines of galena in Gebelzeit was Hathor, surprise. So she was worshipped there as the Lady of the Galena. So I'm not saying that these were all offerings to Hathor, but certainly there was a connection there. The second figurine in particular was from a group of figurines from Gebelzeit, and now is at the Louvre. And many of them had this wig made with unbaked mud beads, like the paddle dolls that we have just seen. And some of these little figurines also were found wrapped in decorated linen, which we could argue it could be a way to limit their power, or take them out at the right time to reveal their magical power. So, or maybe it was just a way to discard them without the need of breaking them into many pieces, as it was happening to others. The third one is my favorite, is a flat clay figurine with a small head and large hips that seems to have come from, seems to have a Babylonian origin. So this is brought forward by the Petrie Museum. There are different datings for these figurines. So for example, the ones from Deir el-Medina seem to be from the New Kingdom, while this one seems to be dated to the later New Kingdom. So anyway, but this is the Babylonian origin seems to be quite plausible. So this kind of figurine is the last one. No, it's not the last one. I'm going to show you another one. This is another type of figurine which I would call mainly votive, because they were used mainly as religious offerings, and they were mainly found in temple areas. These figurines were made of faience, but also baked pottery, were created with an open mold. And as you can see, it has a more elongated body, a small breast and slender waist, and a very rough feet, once again. And she's holding a lotus flower, which is, a very important symbol of rebirth, regeneration in ancient Egypt. There are women holding lotus flower, and not just women, also in temple reliefs, for example, temple paintings. So this is, they say that the dots at hip level could be tattoos. It seems more like a girdle. But anyway, this is, I just wanted to show you this figurine. Keep it in mind, because when we look at the Greek figurines, this will come back. So, okay. And then finally, this is the last figurine of pottery that I'm going to show you. So there are groups of figurines which may attest, or almost certainly attest, an important phase of women's life, which is the postpartum confinement. And this is a favorite theme, both in figurines, but also in decorated ostraca from the New Kingdom, in particular from the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina. So images of a postpartum represent the mother and the newborn child. Sometimes, as you can see in this first image on the left, there is a servant attending to the mother. And sometimes, as you can see again in this ostraca, there are some cute little demons, best demons, that entertain the mother in confinement, but also protect her. So they hold a knife and they hold musical instruments. These bed figurines perhaps represent the same theme, the postpartum confinement, and they are made of faience, pottery, and limestone. As you can see, the child can either be a newborn or a toddler. And in the second one, the child is playing with the hair of the mother. The papyrus Westcar, which I've already mentioned above, has the story of the birth of a triplet of pharaoh from the 5th dynasty. And the mother of these pharaohs has to spend a period of postpartum confinement of 14 days. So I found that there are interesting comparisons about this postpartum confinement with the Near East, where confinement is also mentioned, because women are considered weak, but also impure. So there is this double meaning to it. And with Greece, where there is more evidence for this in relation to temple access. So in sacred law, the sacred laws, this set of inscriptions, say that women cannot enter the temple sometimes for 40 days after childbirth. So finishing with the pottery ones, we go to the more basic ones, but very interesting kinds of figurines. So this is an unusual category which has a lot to do with ritual use, and these are female and male figurines on bread loaves. In this New Kingdom village of Deir el-Medina, which I've already mentioned, we find these bread loaves in 2 tombs. This is in the Eastern Necropolis. One was certainly buried with an infant child, while the other one perhaps with a full-sized individual. So it could be a teenager, but it could also be an adult. So the child in the loaf in 1378. Okay, so 1378 is the name of the tomb. So the bread loaf in this one had the male attributes and raisins for the eyes, while the other bread loaf, the bigger one, 1380, was a female loaf, if we can say that, with the raisins for the eyes again, and that one was the one buried with the adult. We just don't know what this was for. We can see this with these loaves, and we can only argue. Yeah, this was connected with some ritual. They were accompanying the infant after, in the afterlife. And these are some of the bread baskets that were used for the deposition of infants. You might be more familiar with, for example, deposition in amphora, while this is a practice which was more common in Egypt. So I also wanted to show you these, sorry for the name, roughly made female figurines, because these show really the urgent need to represent the female body in order to, have some sort of perform some sort of ritual. And you can see in both, this is one is made of unbaked clay and the other one is an ostrakon, a decorated ostrakon. You can see that mainly there is a stress on the sexual reproductive body parts. And they are made with cheap materials, of course, which could be immediately found there. One of these ostrakons, so this ostrakon represents a woman who wears a necklace, a girdle, and so again you can see there are the belly button, the pubic triangle, and again the girdle around the hips. There are always the same elements that return, even though the representation is different. Now, if you're not too tired, we have the second part of the lecture. And this second part, in this second part, we open, like Egypt did, to the Greek world. In the late dynastic period, we are talking about the 7th century BC. And why do we have a change here? Well, we can say that Greek iconography influenced Egyptian iconography, at least from the Ptolemaic period onwards, really changed it quite a lot. But the first elements of syncretism can be observed as early as the late period in areas of Egypt inhabited by the Greeks. And the main urban centers in Egypt inhabited by Egyptians and Greeks together were Naucratis and Herakleion, which you can see in the map on the right. There was also a very large group of Greek mercenaries in the area of Memphis, and smaller groups in the areas where protective garrisons were established in order to guard the Egyptian borders. Such Greek influence led to various transformations within the production of fertility images. For example, while in the previous period the figurines were mainly produced in faience, from the Ptolemaic era onwards, they were produced in terracotta. So here I'm jumping to the Ptolemaic period. And I could go on with the changes, but what I want to show you first is that the artistic influence was not, on one side, so from Greece to Egypt, but it was mutual. And so, for example, we can see this from the 7th century BC. You might say, but no, the Kouroi are appearing in the 6th. But from the 7th century BC, the Greeks developed a new style, which was called the Daedalic. And this was not an Egyptian style, like a Greco-Egyptian style. This would be wrong to say. It was a mix, Egyptian-Phoenician style, which derived from the contacts with the Near East and Egypt. And in particular, I would say the gesture of this Cretan statue that you can see in, it's called the Statuette of Auxerre, and it's at the Louvre, could be connected with the goddess Astarte, which is a Near Eastern goddess. But so this is the Daedalic style. There's not just this statue. You can see also vases. So it's quite well represented and amazing. So look it up. But a century later, we find the Kouroi. Kore means maiden, young woman. And the Kouroi were full-sized. So this is something unprecedented. We don't have a full-sized, female figurines in Egypt. We have statues, of course, but they are always identifiable. So here we have these big full-sized women, but do you notice something compared to our figurines? They are dressed, okay? They have attributes, they hold offerings. They are quite stiff, their body is quite stiff, and they have a joint feet. When the feet are visible, they have joint feet. What is their function of these Kouroi? They were both found in sanctuaries and in cemeteries. So they were both offerings, but also grave markers. But most of the ones we know are actually coming from a deposit excavated in the Acropolis in the 19th century. We also found the Kouroi, the male statues. And I think it's important to mention them because they are naked. And so the Kouroi appear around the same time, but they are not, they are dressed, while the Kouroi are naked. So there is more of an urge for the Greeks to represent the male body naked rather than the female body, while it's the other way around in Egypt, definitely. And this is a bit of a generic statement, but I hope it's thought-provoking. So as the Kouroi, they have a sort of Near Eastern and Egyptian influence. And one of the archetypes, although it's a bit simplistic, but definitely something very, very similar, can be seen in this small statue from Naucratis, which dates from the same time as the earliest of this Kouroi, 506 BC. So not only they differ from the Kouroi because they are naked, but also because they don't have any attributes. So they don't have any jewels, they don't have any votive offerings, but they do share the same functions or contexts of use with the Kouroi. In fact, they were found both in sanctuaries and cemeteries. And in either context, they represent idealized substitutes of these aristocratic youths. And they also showed these people at the peak of their physical beauty. And so they were immortalized like heroes. But the votive, we have said that the Kouroi also had the function of grave markers. And actually, this is not always easy to attest, except for a couple of examples, such as this one, the statue of the Kore Phrasikleia. We do know it was a grave marker because it has an inscription. And she speaks in the first person. She says, I am the Kore Phrasikleia, and I'm dead now. And unfortunately, I will stay Kore forever. It's a lot better than what I say. I should have probably read it to you, but it's a bit long. But notice something. The gesture, she is holding a lotus bud. Okay, maybe I'm skipping some intermediate, phases here, but it's again this gesture that comes back to us. So, and obviously originally it was fully painted, so I think it's important that we keep this in mind when we look at them. So apart from the Kouroi, do we have an equivalent for Egyptian figurines in Greece? My answer is perhaps. We don't know. So this is a quick glimpse into my next book, very early times for it. But I would say there is a group of funerary stelae from the 4th century BC Attica that represents maidens holding a doll. And however, the problem with these dolls is that they don't look like toys. They don't have articulated limbs like other dolls that are archaeologically attested. And they're actually just basically limbless figures, like our Egyptian faience doll from the Middle Kingdom. So what was their function? Were they considered models for the girls that could be inspired by these little objects? How do they relate to the other doll-like figures? So these are some of the questions that I will try to answer in my next phase of research. I can also give you some more concrete examples of how Egyptian female figures traveled to Greece and influenced the Greek sculpture. So, for example, this bronze figurine from an early archaic votive deposit of the Temple of Hera in Samos, was offered to this temple, and it's part of a big group of Egyptian objects. The faience ones were very recently published, but yeah, I seem to be the only one really excited about it. I don't know why, but I think it's really, really incredible. So there's a huge amount of Egyptian objects in the early archaic Temple of Hera. And obviously, so there is an evidence of a contact with the Egyptian material culture in Greece. And what is this figurine doing? I think this is quite an interesting move. This figurine represents the goddess Hathor. It was studied also by Nicholas Reeves very recently. And he says that the upper limbs of this figurine are frozen in a position in which the figurine was dedicated. So what was she doing? So he says she was dressed originally, and so she was lifting her skirt to reveal her genitals. Do you remember this gesture? We have already seen it in the paddle dolls. So it's something we have that it belongs to Egyptian heritage. And we can compare this figurine with another almost contemporary, a bit earlier, Egyptian figurine that is from Egypt. And in this case, it is made of wood. And you can see that the arm of this figurine can be lifted through a thread that is hidden within the figurine itself. So you can lift the arm by pulling the thread under the foot, and also you can also bring the arm back. So this figurine is covering and uncovering her genitals. So we have an example from Samos and an example from Egypt, unfortunately unprovenanced. So surprise, the Greek sculptor Praxiteles, so this is a big jump, in the 4th century BC might have been inspired by these ritual gestures when he sculpted his Aphrodite of Cnidus, one of the first, if not the first, full-sized naked female sculptures in ancient Greece. Here, in this case, we can say that this is the gesture of the pudica, of the woman, covering her genitals. But at the same time, we could also argue that she attracts the attention to the covered genitals and to her discovered breasts. And just a quick remark to say that this is an ideal Greek female body, but it is not meant to be an oppressive model for women. There are no sources, as far as I know, that say that women should be either skinny or fleshy. There is more in Greece an ideal of balance, which is more associated with good health rather than with an external image. So staying with Aphrodite of Cnidus for now, according to Pliny the Elder, Praxiteles made two statues, one draped and one naked, this one. So Kos decided to go for the draped one and Cnidus the naked one for his temple of Aphrodite. And guess which one was more successful? The naked one, which gave a huge popularity to Cnidus. And we don't have, unfortunately, the original of this statue, but we can see, for example, what it looked like from coins. And I gave you a bad example of a coin, but just, you know, you can find them online, really. There's lots. And I also found a very interesting Lucian's description of this statue, because it says that she was smiling. The original was smiling. Her lips are slightly parted by a lofty smile. Nothing hides her beauty, which is entirely exposed, other than a furtive hand veiling her modesty. So this is not demonstrating anything, but I've always wondered why the Isis, Aphrodite female figurines in Egypt are smiling. And this is something I haven't found, you know, in the Dynastic period. And all of a sudden, in the Ptolemaic figurines are smiling. So is this an influence from the Aphrodite of Cnidus that was really far-reaching? We do know that it was far-reaching. It influenced the material culture, it was reproduced numerous times all over the Greco-Roman world. So perhaps, or perhaps it's just not related, and, you know, it's a cheeky smile, definitely, though, because, for example, this the one at the center is Besit, so it's the female counterpart of the demon god Bes, who was, you know, like the leprechaun. It was protective, but also not bad, but quite cheeky at the same time. You know, it was a bit apotropaic. But you know, I'm simplifying things, but I thought it's quite interesting. And another thing that evolves over time and you know, acquires influences not just from Greece but also from the Near East is the image of the Anassirmene in Egypt. So while the Aphrodite of Cnidus, we have seen she's covering herself, the representation of this Ather Aphrodite goddess that develops in the Greco-Roman period in Egypt lifts her skirt very, very explicitly. And this takes off really from the Hellenistic period, especially. So while in the 7th century BC is still, you know, the representation is still quite stiff and perhaps mainly influenced by Astarte, from the Ptolemaic period, we have huge influences from at least two Greek goddesses, Aphrodite and Demeter. And this gesture of the Anassirmene lifting the dress is no longer just connected with the Egyptian story of Ather, but also with the myth of Demeter, who was cheered up by an old lady who lifted her skirt and showed her genitals to the goddess. And this leads us to the last figurines for today that I'm going to show you, which are called with a very controversial name, the Baubo name. This is the name of the old lady who showed her genitals to Demeter in order to distract her from the pain of Persephone's loss. The name Baubo is present in the Orphic fragments of Clement of Alexandria. I will not go too much into detail about this. So I perceive this name, I interpret this name as mainly a typological name, and you know, we can find a different one perhaps in time, but for now it's a good one. The reason for calling these terracottas Baubo terracotta is that actually for some of them there was a link to Demeter. And in particular, in this case, you can see that these figures are sitting on wild boars, and this connects them with the ritual, the Eleusinian rituals and the Thesmophoria, which were festivals in honor of Demeter and Persephone, which were taken from Greece and brought to Alexandria in Egypt by the Ptolemies. So they were celebrated there. But the iconography is typically Greco-Egyptian rather than Greek. And another element in Ptolemaic figurines, for example, is the representation of purification. And I don't know how to interpret this, you know, 100%. So my theory is that these women washing themselves could be purifying themselves from pregnancy, pollution, especially because under this magical gem there is the name Omphale. And you'll find a lot about Baubo Omphale in Dazen, Veronique Dazen's publications. I'm just saying that, yeah, this is something that appears in this period. And the other representation of Baubo is pregnancy. And this is quite interesting because this is the first explicit representation of pregnancy in women. You have noticed all the dynastic female figurines were, you know, not pregnant, definitely, apart from the roughly made ones which had a little bit of belly. The only pregnant figurine that I can think of is the Hippo goddess Tauret, who is not a woman. She has the body of a woman, sagging breast, big fat belly, but is not fat, is pregnant. And she is a hippo. She's not a human. And while in the Greco-Roman period, we have definitely these pregnant figures. And you can see that they have not just a pregnant belly, but also very pronounced belly button. And this, I was forgetting, this one in the middle was like a rattle. So it had some pellets in it. And so perhaps it was used as a rattle to soothe babies. Quite a strange rattle, if you ask me, but it's nonetheless a rattle. Now, to conclude what we said today, representations of women's body, as you have seen, were essential in dynastic Egyptian religion and rituals of everyday life. And we can see this from the urgency of sketching a female body, even on an ostracon or a piece of clay. They had mainly a positive meaning and were connected with rebirth, fertility, but they were also used to channel magical power. And they could possibly be used even for curses, for all we know. But they represented ideal bodies, but it doesn't look like they were setting a model to follow. The exchange between Greece and Egypt shows that there was a mutual influence between the two. And Egypt contributed, for example, to the representation of the Kouroi and Kouroi, and perhaps even to the themes of later small and full-sized statues. While Greek classical and Hellenistic influence gave the stiff Egyptian female figurines a more naturalistic look, a smile, a fleshy body, and even a pregnant belly. However, these figurines still maintained a characteristic unchanged from the dynastic period. They were still representing undetermined figurines, generic women, but with a very powerful body. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ada. That was amazing. We got a couple of people applauding in the